Welcome to the Joe Cohen Show. Join me as I share my experience with biohacking and invite top health experts to explore the latest technology, supplements, research, and resources for optimizing your body and brain. Hey everyone, I am very excited to be bringing on Dr. Carrie Jones, ND. She's an internationally recognized speaker, consultant, and educator on the topics of women's health and hormones with over 20 years in the industry. Dr. Jones graduated from the National University of Natural Medicine in Portland, Oregon, where she has completed a 2-year residency in women's health, hormones, and endocrinology. She got her degree in a Master's of Public Health. Dr. Jones was also one of the first to become board certified through the American Board of Naturopathic Endocrinology. She was the medical director at the Dutch Test for nearly a decade and is a clinical expert for the Lifestyle Matrix Resource Center and Under Armour. Currently, she's the head of medical education at Rupa Health and the host of the Root Cause Medicine podcast. I've brought her on today to talk about things that I feel were not talked about enough, which is female health, hormones, estrogen, and some kinds of testing, maybe some alternative testing like the Dutch test. And so I'm very excited to have you on, Dr. Carrie.
Well, thanks, Joe. This is great. I'm really excited to talk to you about this.
Awesome. So when it comes to female health, can you take me through some of the main differences that a woman has to know that if something does well for a man, it might not do well for a woman because her hormones are different?
So it's the same hormones. It's just different amounts and different rhythmicity. So for females, I don't know that a lot of the public knows this, but for years and years, women were left out of research studies. And recently, as we know, a lot of women will get left out unless they are menopausal or on something that controls their hormones, such as the birth control pill, because we have that up-down rhythm every month, like a controlled roller coaster of estrogens, progesterones, et cetera. And so it's really important for women to know this, is that up-down roller coaster actually impacts everything from our mood to our libido to even things like our immune system, how our thyroid works. And so that's very different, right, from men's health, where men are pretty stable. Their testosterone does go up through the night and the morning, but otherwise they don't have an up-down monthly rhythm like we do. And knowing that difference can be really helpful. Like I said, with even how people train, even how women train, they can tell a difference if they're close to their period or if their period has just ended.
Okay. So let's go through that a bit because I want to parse it down.
Yeah.
For women who are training, for example, how does their cycle or their hormone cycle affect how they should train?
This is what's really cool. There's been a lot of research and a lot of education around this most recently. There's a researcher in New Zealand, Dr. Stacey Sims, and she kind of really popularized the phrase, women are not small men, because she really has looked at how do women train. And I don't mean you have to train like Olympics training. If somebody's listening to this going, well, I'm not an athlete, but if you go run or if you work out or if you're taking spin class or Pilates, it doesn't matter. You've probably noticed it feels different at different times of your cycle. So when you get your period, your hormones are really low. Estrogen and progesterone as a group are really, really low. And by about day 3, 4, or 5 of your period, women tend to feel more superhuman. They feel they're more stable, more steady. I'm not saying everybody, but for the most part, exercise tends to be easier. They can do more explosive things. They can lift heavier. They can sprint if that's what they're doing. They don't feel like they're running through quicksand anymore. Now, as we get towards the other end, as we get closer to our period, then we may find that it is harder to do the explosive things, the sprinting, the heavy lifting, and we might be better going slower, doing more stretching, more gentle yoga, or even, gentle Pilates, where you don't feel like you're going through quicksand or hitting a wall, knowing that your period's about to start. Now, this doesn't happen for everybody. And of course, a lot of these things, especially in the world of actual athletes, is trainable. You can train to your cycle. But sometimes it's really nice to know this for women who go, I feel like I'm going crazy. Like I could run the furthest I ever did 2 weeks ago. And now I can barely complete a mile. I'm just so tired. And then their period comes and they're like, oh, that's what it is.
So how does that the estrogen affect their energy levels? So you were mentioning that
Mhm,
estrogen goes down when their period hits or right
mhm,
before, and then
mhm.
day 5 it starts going up and they start getting a lot of energy. What is it about estrogen that is giving women energy?
So it's not so much estrogen by itself, obviously, in no matter whose body it is, everybody works as a symphony, right? Like all the hormones are working together. But the rise in estrogen is definitely playing a big role in the brain, especially in the immune system. Most all the immune cells have an estrogen receptor on them, meaning when your estrogen starts to rise, it impacts your immune system. It had like, and going back to the brain, it impacts areas of neurotransmitters such as your serotonin, your dopamine. It even affects water retention, which, of course, when people say they feel like they're running through quicksand or they feel like they're heavier than they were, which can weigh them down, it affects their sleep. Estradiol, your main estrogen, has an impact on especially your REM sleep. Do you fall asleep? Do you stay asleep? Those kind of things. And so when you add all those together, and they're with other hormones, there's a lot more areas, then that can definitely impact your energy and just the up down effect. Men don't have that up down rhythm of estrogen. So imagine if maybe you've said before, I feel like I'm riding this roller coaster of energy. You're actually truly on a controlled roller coaster for your hormones. They're not static, they're quite dynamic.
Okay, and so somebody would know if this is a hormonal problem if, for example, the same time every month they're getting these crashes or this burst of energy. So if they can track it in terms of the rhythm, then it's the same problem rather than if somebody just, every once in a while that it isn't correlated with their cycle, they feel down or whatever. So
Yeah.
I assume you would recommend tracking how you feel, how much energy you have according to your cycle.
I think it's immensely helpful, yes. And it is surprising to me the number of women who don't, the number of women who don't even track their cycle, let alone know if their symptoms are related to their cycle. Migraines are a big one. I would have a lot of women come in and say, I get migraines, help me with my migraines. And I would say, is it related to your cycle? Or is it related, is it kind of random? And the number of women that would go, I don't know. I never actually thought to pay attention. And sure enough, they would, we would work on their migraines, but they would come back and go, I asked my partner, or, my best friend pointed out, or maybe their mom. And everyone's like, it's always when you get your period, just FYI, or it's always around ovulation. And in migraines is a big symptom, but a lot of other things can be as well. Insomnia, again, the fatigue or burst of energy, how they train their immune system. I mean, there's something called a period flu, which is when you get the drop or the decline in hormones close to your period. And a lot of women will start to feel sick and they think, oh my gosh, once again, I'm getting sick, whatever it is, it got me. And then their period comes and their symptoms go away. And I had a lot of women reach out to me and go, I didn't know this was a real thing, but I do get this every month or almost every month. Or even histamine issues. They'll say, I feel very itchy, sneezy. My histamine symptoms are back. I'm scratchy. I don't know what's going on. It must be allergies. And then their period comes and their symptoms go away. And so if you can track those things together, that's really helpful. Just as you said, versus a one-off random, like you were sniffy and itchy one day because it was allergies, as opposed to it is actually related more toward your hormones.
Right. So yeah, I definitely think that everybody should track it to make sure, because if
Yeah.
it is cyclical based on your hormones, then you could identify what to do about it more. Because you could track, okay, what do these hormones do, and how can I either add hormones or compensate in some other way for what the hormones would normally do. Let's go into each of the aspects because I think they're each interesting. So, for example, you mentioned estrogen and immune system. So,
Mhm.
I want to go through each one and say, and one hormone at a time, just so that we could break it down and say, okay, estrogen we know goes down right before the period starts, and then so it's the period, the first 5 days, a little before that's the down estrogen down period. What happens with the immune system, and we'll go through each one of those things that you mentioned.
So the immune system is tricky. So estradiol has a role in, so we have a number of different cells that play a role, of course, in our immune system, and they have estrogen receptors on them. But depending on the cell and a lot of other factors around it, estrogen generally, but not always, is helpful for the immune system. Now, for some people, it's actually hurtful. Think like certain autoimmunes. Some people feel better at their period. Their immune symptoms go away close to their period because their estrogen is really low. So for them, the drop of estrogen is actually quite helpful for an overactive immune system. Now, for other people, it's the opposite. They get their period and feel 10x worse, right? Their immune
Okay.
system feels 10x worse. So I have talked to a mentor of mine is a PhD in microbiology and immunology, and we talk about this all the time. And she says with the immune system and estrogen, it's not as easy to pin down of like, oh, estradiol in particular does this one thing because it doesn't ever act alone. And so when we're looking at the immune system, I'm like, well, generally it's helpful. Generally, it's a good thing when you have estrogen imbalance and it's doing the thing it's supposed to do. But it also is dependent on your progesterone, your cortisol, a whole bunch of other markers, and also what's going on in your system, autoimmune. So I don't have the best answer. I know you can, look up in studies to see what does estrogen do for, neutrophils, what does estrogen do for lymphocytes, et cetera. But again, as my mentor said, she's like, it's actually a lot more complicated than that because estrogen never acts alone. But
Okay.
generally, we can say it's helpful to the immune system.
Fair enough. And the immune system is quite complex as well, as you said.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. But if
So what
women
about
listening right now, I don't mean to cut you off, but if somebody's listening and they're like, oh my gosh, I never thought about this before. I have, let's pretend, multiple sclerosis, MS, and I can tell my symptoms are worse or better when I get my period. Or maybe somebody's listening to this and has moved into menopause and their symptoms have gotten so much worse. So now they know, okay, maybe the drop in hormones plays a role in their immune system. Or maybe they've moved into menopause and their autoimmune symptoms have gotten so much better. So now we know that the rise of estrogen through their cycling years was actually a big trigger to worsen their autoimmune symptoms. And now their estrogen's quite low in menopause and they're feeling a lot of relief. So even those types of things are being studied in women, which is very cool, especially as you said in the beginning, if women are tracking and can identify this, it can be helpful.
right? What about when we go to some other things like sleep, for example? How is estrogen affecting sleep?
Believe it or not, progesterone as a hormone, gets all the accolades when it comes to sleep. And I'll go back to estrogen in just a second. So the reason is progesterone is calming to the system. It's calming, soothing, relaxing, everything is going to be okay type of hormone. It's anti-anxiety for a reason. So if you don't have a lot of progesterone, you may find as you get close to your cycle or menopause, perimenopause, you don't sleep as well. But it turns out estradiol also plays a role in your ability to fall asleep and stay asleep. And so we also can see this, especially as women hit perimenopause and menopause, that progesterone gets all the love, but maybe their doctor decides to put them on hormone replacement therapy of estrogen, and that's really what does it. That does help them stay asleep. Now, there are a lot of reasons somebody might not stay asleep, but that lack of estrogen, its impact on brain neurotransmitters, which of course, many of them can be calming and soothing and relaxing, impact how somebody stays asleep. And staying asleep is a big, big complaint for a lot of women. I had a lot of women come into my practice and go, I can't sleep anymore. What's the deal? Or I can't sleep the night or two before my period, or I can't sleep at ovulation, or I've hit perimenopause and I can't sleep. What's changed? Oh, everything. Everything has changed. Yeah.
Exactly. That's very interesting because I've been studying sleep more. I've been in the sleep hacking period for a few months. I go into different cycles, if you will, no pun intended. But I've, so sleep is on my radar. And one of the things I was, kind of researching is how to get more REM sleep. And I
Mm,
was researching it and also doing experiments, how to also stay asleep more. And some of the things I've realized over the past years is that GABA is very good at increasing REM sleep,
mm,
and progesterone increases GABA.
mhm.
So that makes sense that progesterone is going to increase REM and estrogen might also increase REM sleep, but I could also see how it increases the ability to stay asleep because serotonin is very important in staying asleep, and estrogen increases serotonin. As far as I understand, is everything I just said correct?
Yeah. So estradiol, as far as I understand it, estradiol stimulates the mRNA to get you from tryptophan to 5-HTP. So if you have appropriate levels of estradiol, then that your chain to make serotonin will be appropriate. Tryptophan, 5-HTP, and then it will go on to make serotonin. The tryptophan, as you know, the tryptophan to 5-HTP is the critical step. It's the rate limiting step. So if you have appropriate estradiol, and this we're talking about women, but this 100% applies to men. How many men do you know who've really bottomed out their estrogen levels because they're on an aromatase inhibitor or they're on something, thinking all estrogen is bad in men's health, and it turns out you need some of it. You guys need some of it, and sleep can be impacted. So yeah, no, unfortunately, high estrogen will decrease serotonin as well. So if you have excessive levels of estradiol, then that tryptophan pathway actually gets diverted towards that other pathway, that kynurenine pathway. For those listening, kynurenine with a K, for good reasons. It's to increase your NAD production because for whatever reason, the body's like, stress, let's deal with this, NAD. But now you've diverted away from serotonin. And so you can get less, you don't sleep as well.
I didn't know about that excessive
estradiol. Yeah. So excessive estradiol, excessive cortisol, and inflammatory cytokines can push you down the kynurenine pathway and away from the serotonin pathway. So sadly, it's for a good reason, but sadly, you really can't win. Like too little estradiol and too much estradiol, and you lose out on serotonin production.
But you'll get more energy in the process through the NAD pathway.
Yeah, it's definitely a short-term
You'll be energized.
sure. Yeah.
You'll be irritable and energized. Ready for work.
Everybody's dream.
Yeah. Interesting. And so, but what level of estrogen are we talking about? Because a man with high estrogen is not going to get to a level of a woman with high estrogen.
Correct. And that's definitely body specific. So one of the things in women's health that a lot of the graphics get wrong is that estradiol and progesterone are not made in the same amount. So estradiol is made in micrograms and progesterone is made in milligrams. So a lot of the graphics, when they show you the drawing of the rise and fall of hormones through the month, they always make estradiol higher than progesterone, and forgetting that the amount actually made is in the microgram level. So it's really a ratio between estradiol in micrograms and progesterone in milligrams. Now that can all change as she gets into menopause, because that progesterone, which should be in the 20 to 40 milligram range, will drop down to less than 1 milligram when she gets into menopause, which again, I say this often, I don't know who designed perimenopause or menopause. I would like a word with them. Not a fan with how we get in there and the things that happen. I'd like to make some changes, but it's that shift in micrograms up in estrogen and often the shift down in milligrams of progesterone that makes a difference. So now you lose GABA, and then that rise in estradiol. Now you potentially lose serotonin and just feel out of whack.
Okay. And at what point in the cycle does estradiol get too high?
Right before
it has
ovulation.
The opposite effect. Okay.
Right before ovulation. So we need a really big burst of estradiol to help with the release of the egg ovulation. So this is why if somebody is testing, if a woman is listening and she's going to go, okay, I'm going to go get my hormones tested. I listen to Carrie and Joe. I'm going to go get hormones tested. You want to know where you are in your cycle. If the first day of your period is day 1, because if you go get a blood draw for estradiol and it's right before ovulation, it might be 300, 350, 400, 200, and you're going to freak out. But that's normal right before ovulation. So this is why timing matters, because it really truly is a controlled roller coaster. You just happen to be on the biggest hill of the roller coaster at that time. You're supposed to.
Right. But during that time, that means that serotonin could drop because the estradiol is too high.
It could, yes. It could. What I don't know, and what I don't know is being researched, is how it is our serotonin and our brain production smart enough to know this is part of the ovulatory reproductive process. And so
Hmm.
does it counter shift through the whole cycle as well? I don't know that if that's been studied. You and I
Okay.
intelligently talking about this would hope
Right.
that, my brain would go, oh, it's just before ovulation. This is like 24 hours of high estradiol. I got this. I don't know. I hope my
And what
tryptophan's that intelligent. I don't know.
you want to hear about the one health hack that is sure to change your life? Okay, here it is. Subscribing to this podcast. 67% of listeners aren't subscribed to the show, so please don't forget to show your support by hitting the subscribe button now. You'll not only be supporting the show, but also investing in yourself and your health journey, all while helping to keep us ad-free. Click the subscribe button now and enjoy the rest of the episode. And when do you suggest getting tested? When is a good time to get blood tests to see your hormones?
In the cycle, or what symptoms they're having, or both.
In the cycle.
So ideally, when you're doing hormonal testing, if the two hormones we've talked about the most today is estradiol and progesterone, we tend to test them together, and we tend to test them 5 to 7 days after ovulation. So if you have a 28-day cycle, if you're listening to this and you're like, yeah, I'm pretty consistent, 28 to 30 days, then generally it's going to be day 19, 20, or 21, somewhere in that window that you're going to test.
Okay.
And the reason we do that is we're trying to catch the progesterone spike with the estrogen middle spike at that time at the same time. There are other hormones we check at different parts of the cycle, but if you're trying to catch those two together, we do it later. We do it 5 to 7 days after ovulation.
Don't we want to check, let's say, when somebody's feeling good, so maybe day 5 or maybe day 14, see, check at different times of the month?
In that case, what I recommend then is what's called a cycle mapping or cycle map test. A number of companies have the ability for you to at home collect every day or every other day of your cycle and then send it in, mail it
Mhm.
in, and the company graphs it out. And so if you said to me, I have a friend, she's getting migraines right before ovulation and right before her cycle, I'm like, yes, let's check that cycle mapping. Or if somebody says, my autoimmune symptoms seem to be very hormone related, they go up and down through the month, then absolutely, I agree with you. Yes, they should check
Okay.
that. In those types of tests are nice because it's all in one box. It gets graphed out for you, and then you can clearly sort of see that up down rhythm or not of the hormones. Yeah.
Right. And what kind of testing should they do? Do you recommend Dutch tests? I feel like the Dutch tests do have some controversy behind them.
It does
It's
have
like a
controverscy. Yeah.
yeah.
So when it comes to a cycle mapping every day, there's two types of collection out there. Saliva, so you spit in a tube, or urine, which Dutch is one of them, where you urinate on a strip. The reason those are the most easy to do is just because you can do it at home and you don't have to get a blood draw every day or every other day. Nobody has time for that. And ouch, I don't want to get a blood draw every day or every other day checking my hormones. So those are the two options you'll do in that long cycle mapping. If you're just looking at like, hey, Carrie, Joe, I just want to look at my estradiol and progesterone, or I like throw testosterone in there, you can absolutely go get your blood drawn 100%. The reason that I like the addition of the urine markers with it, like in the Dutch test, is that I can see what are called metabolites or the breakdown products or the pathways those hormones are going. So you may have healthy levels of estrogen, but they may be going down in, incorrect pathways, which is where you come in, right? Your testing comes in. If they genetically have a SNP that's going to push them down a pathway we don't want, I'd like to know that either from your test or real time doing a Dutch test, which is a urine test, or some other urine test. And this is a big area of study in things like breast cancer. If estrogen is not the villain, the absolute only villain in breast cancer, of course, but if we can modify some of these pathways, just as you talk about, then I'm all for it. And that's why I like to add it in there.
Right. That makes sense. I mean, also with the genetics, you could see your genetic predisposition in general
Mhm.
for higher or lower estrogen, prolactin,
Yes.
testosterone, all kinds of different hormones. And you can also see, for example, so for me, we were talking about the tryptophan hydroxylase,
Mm-hmm.
the
Hmm.
conversion from tryptophan to 5-HTP. In my case, it's always been not functioning very well.
Mm.
And it wasn't so much related to estrogen because my estrogen is pretty high for a guy, and I actually like it there. So whenever it's higher, I like it. I try to push it up. I find in general I feel better with higher estrogen, but it's not an estrogen problem for me. And so what I found, and I always knew that I was deficient on this tryptophan hydroxylase gene. For me, it was more related to genetic variants.
Mm.
And also, I needed some of those cofactors to increase the tryptophan hydroxylase
Mm-hmm.
enzyme. So some of those cofactors included methylfolate and niacin, nicotinic acid. Those increase that pathway. And I actually think in that case we were talking about the kynurenine pathway where tryptophan gets shunted to create NAD.
Mm-hmm.
So I think if you have enough niacin, it's not going to take tryptophan to create NAD because you already basically it's creating niacin in that pathway, as I
Mm-hmm.
understand it. And it's going to instead is going to increase the conversion from tryptophan to 5-HTP while it's also going to create enough NAD without needing to take out tryptophan. So basically, if somebody's having that negative effect that we discussed, it would make sense that niacin would counteract that. Have you found in your experience that is that something you ever recommend?
Yes, and I'll be honest, I've definitely, in a pinch, as a Band-Aid, have said, "I think you need 5-HTP," especially when they describe their sleep or mood type symptoms to me. I was talking with a doctor recently, Dr. Kate Henry, and she was explaining, especially for women with low serotonin, they tend to find a negative in things, and in a survival situation, you're out in the forest. Like, you want to be able to pick out the negative in things easily. But she was saying when you have low serotonin, especially women, they pick up on that. They recognize the negative. But in real world experience now, in the 21st century, she said this might manifest as picking out the negative in your significant other or in your job or in the things around your house. And it was really eye opening to me because a lot of women who came into my practice felt like as their hormones were shifting, they were suddenly more negative. Now, I'm not putting the entire blame on serotonin. I know there are other places that or things that go into that. But I thought, man, if we could just get taught that, if we, that to recognize at a young age that hormones play such a big role in these neurotransmitters. And if you are feeling extra negative, niacin B vitamins in general, I feel sadly, a lot of people are remiss on. And sometimes I would add in with the B vitamins, hey, look, we're going to do some short-term 5-HTP because I don't want you being so negative or struggling with sleep and until we can get you back up to where you should be with the B vitamins and then go from there. So yes, I do.
In my experience from, just from watching certain people, so I don't, you probably aren't aware, but I have a supplement that's called Joe's Mood Daily,
Hmm.
and it's concentrated on serotonin. So it has 5-HTP, it has some cofactors for it. It has some other things that increase serotonin. And so it's very good at increasing serotonin, increases some other things as well, but I would say it's more focused. If you're looking at all the neurotransmitters, it's definitely more focused on serotonin because that's kind of what I had to deal with in the past.
Hmm.
And so that's kind of where I came from. So there's a number of women who take this that I know, and they will say like they take it, during the cycle where, a certain point in the cycle where they start getting crazy and
Yeah.
that according to their own words, not mine.
Yes. No, no, I got it. I got it.
According to their own words, when they start getting crazy, yeah, and they say they take it, they feel much better, right? And so this is and it makes sense because it's increasing serotonin when you need it more. And I think in general, we live in a society where people need more serotonin, right? I feel like when you're under more stress, the body burns over more serotonin, number one. So it turns over more, we don't have the proper nutritional balance always, like enough B vitamins, enough, health practices that it could very easily, we don't create serotonin in a bunch of ways, and that's why people have a bunch of sleep problems. We overstress our nervous system, even just by things like getting light at night is a stress on the nervous system. And so, and just I feel like society is built in a very stressful way, urban living and working in an office and things like that. And so I think all these things kind of create a society that has much lower serotonin. And when you combine that with female hormones going down, you get like there's a lot of women that really feel like they're going nuts when their estrogen goes down.
Yeah.
And
And
so I think,
especially,
yeah,
I don't mean to cut you off. I just
no,
to
no,
add
no,
to
go
it, when
for it.
you mentioned like the stress, cortisol has such an impact on female hormones as well. So just to add to it, it just compounds, especially as we get close to our period. If we don't have the progesterone we need, therefore we're not getting the GABA support. As you talk about, obviously GABA being our big inhibitory neurotransmitter, calming essentially, right? So we're missing out on progesterone. We have all this cortisol, which also can push down our progesterone. It from the brain, it just shifts our priorities, support stress, don't necessarily support progesterone. Serotonin is already on not doing great to begin with as a society. I totally agree with you there. And so we are more irritable, crazy, exhausted, negative, leading to our period. Absolutely. If nothing is done, if none of these things are recognized and then supported. And I find the women
Right.
that tend to do the best are the ones who get this kind of, they get off their light at night. They do wear the blue light blocking glasses. They're working with their circadian rhythm. They're working with diet. They're working to lower inflammation. They're working with their stress management. We can't eliminate all the stress, of course. There's no way, but how we handle or how we decompress, et cetera, et cetera. And I do find the women who went from 10 out of 10 bad periods, self-reported as crazy or irritable or negative or awful, with time, they're like, oh, I'm so much better. I did have to make all these changes, but look at me now. And I love that. I love that it's modifiable. We aren't stuck with this.
For sure, for sure. And what I'm wondering is there a time period where, so let's say estrogen goes down, so a woman gets her period for 6 days or whatever it is. Her estrogen's lower. You mentioned she's not going to be as good at sprinting or heavy lifting, things like that. Is there any benefits during that period? Like, is there anything that
Actually,
improved?
that is the time. That is the time to sprint and lift and do that and to do the stuff, because it is actually
Oh,
okay.
okay.
Yeah, that part is okay. It's the leading up to her period when her body, for lack of a better analogy, may or not be nesting, right? So she
Mm,
ovulates. This is a big also concept. Not every woman wants to be pregnant every month. Some do. I get it. Not every woman wants to be pregnant every month, but the body doesn't know that. So the body every single month does the cycle. Why? For reproductive purposes. Give you the option to maybe try to get pregnant if you wanted to. So every single month after you ovulate, release an egg, and the body's like, cool, there is a good chance if you wanted to get pregnant, cross your fingers, we could. So we're going to make the uterus as hospitable as possible. We're going to make it really welcoming. And in the process of building up and making it hospitable, it diverts resources away from you and towards the uterus and towards potential reproduction. So now in that
mhm.
time frame, if you go try to lift heavy, sprint long, run long distances, Peloton for an hour, you might find it's harder, tougher. You don't recover as fast. You're more prone to injury, or you just plain don't want to. You're like, I'm kind of tired. I kind of want to just, relax, stay home, not do these things. And it's for
I
good
see.
reason, because the body is shifting priorities. In the beginning, you get your period, the priority is a little different. And after ovulation, it's like, woohoo, we might get pregnant. So
So,
that's
so do,
that's sort of how I explain it.
right. So during the period, I misunderstood that before. You're
Yeah.
saying that people can sprint and heavy lift better because they're not shunting resources to
Yes.
ovulation.
Yes. And
Okay.
the estrogen effect on like ligaments and muscles is different. Then as we get close
Hmm.
to their period, then it shifts not for their period, the ovulation. As they get close to ovulation, estrogen goes way up, which has a different effect on ligaments and sprain strain, pulls, things like that. So right before ovulation, be a little careful. If you're doing box jumps, if you're doing explosive movements, I don't want you to get a sprain or a strain or a pull. Just be careful. And then after your ovulation, just dial it down a little bit, maybe be a little more nourishing. So do the power stuff in the beginning during your period, and then wind it down from there, and then start over again. Do the power stuff in the beginning, the first 10, 12 days, and then wind it down from there. Now, again,
And
all of
during
this is trainable. I'm not, people listening to this might go, this doesn't apply to me, or I'm a super athlete. As long as you recognize it, though, in your head, like,
right.
oh, this might be why I didn't hit my PR today. My period's due in 3 days. Okay, got it.
Interesting. And so during this period time, when a woman has her period, her estrogen's lower, her mood may be worse, right?
It may be worse. Yep.
Right,
Because
because of the
it can
lower
take us a
estrogen.
couple days to adjust to that lower estrogen.
Okay. But she's going to have more energy to do sprinting and heavy lifting
Generally.
because less resources are being diverted to creating to ovulation.
Building a nest. Yeah.
Right. Exactly. But that I feel like maybe, and I don't know, but I feel like that could be confounded if somebody's iron deficient and during menstruation they're losing more iron.
Oh,
I wonder
absolutely.
if that, yeah.
There's confounding pieces all over. Absolutely. If you go into your period borderline iron anemic, and then you have heavy periods, which pushes you into full iron anemia, oh, you're going to feel terrible. A lot of women say that. They'll say, gosh, I have really heavy periods, and I feel I'm so tired. I'm very pale. I bruise. This is awful. And then they figure it out, or somebody talks, or they hear a podcast and they eat iron-rich foods, or maybe have to take iron during their period. But ultimately, we want to back up and figure out, why did you even go into your period anemic or borderline anemic in the first place? Is it diet? Is it absorption? Is it bugs, parasites eating it? Is it anemia of chronic disease? Like, what's going on that you already have an iron issue?
Right. And what about dopamine? So dopamine is obviously this hormone for neurotransmitter for motivation and a lot of good things, right? In general, dopamine is a good thing. And I've heard from someone else that progesterone actually can block dopamine. And maybe
My
I'm
understanding
not
is it's
remembering
so
that.
estrogen supports dopamine, is my understanding, and progesterone can have a bit of a negative effect on dopamine. So estrogen, testosterone support dopamine generally. We're just being real general. Whereas progesterone loves GABA and is not as supportive towards dopamine. So you have
Right.
estrogen and testosterone in your court for that, and progesterone's not as friendly.
So that means that maybe during a woman's period, I mean, dopamine is usually going to make you more motivated to work out, right?
It is. Yes.
So
Yes.
women might be able to lift heavier, but if their estrogen is lower, they might be less motivated to lift.
But they will have less progesterone. So your progesterone drops to the absolute lowest in that first part of your cycle. And it only comes out to play in the second half of your cycle, really. So even though your estradiol is low, but it's growing, especially relative to what progesterone would be doing. So you were still, in the first half of your cycle, you're still what's considered more estrogen. Dominant's not the right word, but estrogen is the hormone at play there. Whereas progesterone should be the hormone at play in the second half of your cycle. So relatively, you should have really low progesterone, and estrogen should be winning.
So you have overall
dopamine.
Right. Okay.
Yeah.
That's interesting.
Now, you obviously, as you said earlier, compounding factors. If you have a lot of cortisol, there's a lot of things that can screw up your dopamine. So if somebody's listening to this going, I don't feel good at any point in my cycle, I'm just always tired, I'm never motivated. Okay, take a step back and let's bigger picture what else is going on and why. Is it infection, inflammation? Is it stress? Is it, guts? What's going on?
Right. That makes sense. And what about, how does cortisol play in a cycle? Because you hear about prolactin, progesterone, and estrogen, maybe testosterone, but cortisol, you don't really think of as a woman's hormone that is cyclic during the month.
Right. But we do know, so, and you talk about this in being a biohacker expert. So our circadian rhythm, our cortisol is up in the morning with the sun and down at night, where melatonin comes out. So with the moon. So cortisol is like the sun, melatonin's like the moon. So every single day that circadian rhythm should be, hopefully, a pretty tight system. And your circadian rhythm is dictated by your clock genes in your brain, and those same clock gene have an influence on the reproductive rhythm. So one of the first things I ask women when they say I have irregular cycles, or my cycles suck, or my cycles are terrible, or my hormones are bad, I will say, what is going on with your sleep-wake cycle? Because that's the master cycle that then, of course, filters down and affects your menstrual cycle as well. So cortisol, the circadian rhythm, clock genes definitely have an impact on our menstrual cycle. Now, cortisol itself, cortisol, norepinephrine, and epinephrine, so adrenaline, noradrenaline, and adrenaline, when they are elevated, when you are in a fight or flight stage, especially acutely, or if it's been going on for a couple of weeks, what can happen is that we have hormones in our brain that tell our ovaries what to do. And those hormones in our brain, that gland in our brain, the hypothalamus, is always surveying our territory as females to go, is it safe enough and healthy enough to reproduce? And if cortisol and adrenaline is constantly slamming at it, like stress, stress, alert, 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 then that gland, the hypothalamus, is going to down-regulate, decrease the hormone it sends to the ovaries, which can throw off or change our cycles. So as women, if we're in a real stressful situation, or we've been really sick lately, or we've been traveling, maybe changing time zones, and then we change time zones back, or maybe, God forbid, we're going through a divorce or a death, or something's happened, and then we're like, oh my gosh, I skipped my period this month, or my period came a week early, or my period came a week late, or I didn't ovulate this month. This is so crazy. It's that gland in our brain getting the input from our stress system, essentially, and pivoting. It's diverting. It's likely not the best time to reproduce if adrenaline is constantly coming at that gland in the brain. So while cortisol is not, quote unquote, a female or women's hormone, it has a massive impact on our hormones. And in fact, you mentioned prolactin. So prolactin is our prolactation. So it's, the hormone that goes up with breastfeeding. But even elevated levels of cortisol can slightly increase our prolactin levels. And so it's not high enough necessarily that we may start to produce milk, but it could be high enough, mildly high, that it can, quote, throw off our cycle. So I have had women in real stressful situations, and we check their prolactin just to make sure, because their cycle is weird. And I'm like, oh, you're just over the reference range. You're like 10 or 20 points over the reference range. I bet stress is causing the prolactin to start to creep up, which is causing your body to be confused. What are we doing? Are we breastfeeding? Are we not? And then it's going to affect your cycle. So it is all very tightly related. In fact, even hypothyroid will affect prolactin, which will then affect the cycle.
How does hypothyroid
itself, does it?
How does it do that?
Prolactin?
Yeah.
When you are trying to increase TSH out of the thyroid gland, the brain produces TRH, which TRH also stimulates prolactin. So TRH will start to go up to try to get your TSH up out of your thyroid gland. And as a byproduct, you start to raise prolactin as well. So,
and prolactin,
so it's another way that it throws off our cycle when we're hypothyroid.
Right. And prolactin can be negative in the sense that as prolactin goes up, dopamine goes down, correct?
Prolactin is the only hormone under the dopamine. Dopamine has a chokehold on it. So dopamine keeps prolactin in check. So the lower your dopamine drops, your prolactin can go up. There's a handful of reasons that, and men too, this applies to men, that their prolactin can increase.
Right. And so that's interesting with prolactin. But one of the things that prolactin does cause is inflammation. So, and autoimmunity, right? So I think in general, when I check my prolactin, I like it when it's lower, because that means my dopamine is higher, and my whatever inflammation that prolactin is causing is probably reduced.
Under control. And I do want to clarify, when Joe says higher, he doesn't mean high. He just, at the normal amount to suppress prolactin. It's a healthy amount, right? Not necessarily outright elevated.
Correct. It doesn't have to be show up as, out of control on the lab test, but it's just kind of like the higher it is, the more it's going to do, the lower your dopamine is. It's linear, right?
Yeah.
And the lower the
Yes.
dopamine and the more inflammation that it's going to contribute to if you have an autoimmune profile.
Mhm. Yeah, exactly. And we know prolactin in men have it, the higher prolactin is, has a negative effect on things like testosterone and symptoms that come along with low testosterone. And so a lot of men a lot of practitioners don't even check a prolactin in men because they just assume, oh, that's the breastfeeding hormone. Why would I
Right.
check that? But I have this real interesting story. I was on a plane years ago and I was flying to lecture somewhere and it was on men's health. And I had I had my computer open, my slides deck, and we're landing. And so I closed my computer down and the gentleman next to me, he was probably in his 20s. And he said, "Are you a doctor?" And I said, "Yeah." And he said, "I don't mean to be rude, but I was reading your slides and I'm really glad you mentioned prolactin in men." And I was like, "Okay, what's up?" And he said, "Well, I had a 3-inch prolactinoma in my brain and I had all the symptoms. I had low mood, I was depressed, I had very low testosterone, low libido, no erections, very flat affect until we checked my prolactin. We checked everything, nobody could figure it out. Check prolactin, it was through the roof. Turns out I have a tumor in my pituitary. I'm on the medication to suppress it." And I thought, man, that's so interesting because you rarely hear of men having a prolactinoma. And I don't know if it's because they actually don't get them or because they're not tested for it with their low testosterone, low mood, and erectile issues. And so I always
Okay.
think of him when I talk about prolactin in men or women because men need to know about it as well.
Interesting. Yeah. So I'm one of those men who check my prolactin, and you might not be too
Yay.
surprised about that.
No, but I'm glad. You're like the guy in the plane.
Exactly. Yeah. So I wanted to actually talk about, we spoke about prolactin, progesterone, estrogen. I want to talk about how we can manipulate these hormones in order to optimize our
Mm.
performance, in order to feel better. What are the main things that you recommend to optimize these hormones?
So a lot of people are hoping for the magic supplement. They want me to drop the one thing that's going to help boost their progesterone and balance their estrogen and all these things. And
That
just
would be
like
me.
right, just like you, but you talk about all the time in your newsletters and your sites and everything. I mean, it goes back to the basics. I tell people supplements are super helpful. I'm a big fan of supplements, or even if you at that age you need hormone replacement therapy. And but if you haven't done any of the basics, whether it's diet, movement, sleep, stress management, mood, it's all those things play a massive role. So if somebody has a 10 out of 10 stressful life, they are not sleeping because they're up late working or, watching TV. They don't move at all. They don't go into nature ever. But so then they're like, well, tell me why my hormones are a mess. What supplement can I take? It's like, well, we do have to start with the basics. And so people hate when I say that because it's not sexy. But as you talk about, we start there. So that's the first thing I say is that you really do have to get your circadian rhythm, start there. The foods that you're eating, the quality of foods. Can you digest them? What's going on with your gut health? What kind of inflammation do you have? Do you have joy in your life? Are you doing things to help mitigate the stress that you do have, et cetera, et cetera? And then we can add in the supplemental support. So a lot of the supplemental support are basic things like, vitamins, minerals, and that we just don't get because of the soil and growing conditions and shipping conditions depleting our food. And so I love herbs, but I do definitely like the basics, right? Like I like our B vitamins. Seems like we're not getting a lot of B vitamins. Humans don't make their own vitamin C. So we have to either get that in through food or we have to take it as a supplement. Minerals, a lot of our, even just, water and the things that we eat are really devoid in the basics, our minerals, our fat soluble vitamins, and so when I talk about this stuff, again, you could, like, I haven't yet said a magical herb, which there are herbs that are helpful, but it's amazing to me the number of people across the world who are just sort of missing these key basic things. So I'll start there as my second layer. And then we get into specific herbs. Like what can we do herbally to help support stress? What can we do to help improve progesterone? What can we do to help just ovarian function in general? And these things can vary depending on is like if somebody isn't ovulating because they have stress or hypothyroidism, I'm going to address that differently than somebody who's not ovulating because they have PCOS, elevated insulin, elevated testosterone, et cetera. And so then it becomes very personalized as to what we choose. But if we get that foundation nailed, 80%, I'm an 80-20 girl, then we start there and then we move up in sort of our hierarchy.
I see. Okay, that makes
You're
sense.
like, dang, that's not what I wanted.
No, I think people need to hear that. I agree. I mean, you got to sometimes really the foundations are the most important things, right?
Yeah, and you and I maybe have the foundations already nailed. So when you and I go into tweak things, we are going right. We're like, all right, what herb or what thing or peptide or whatever it is can help with what I'm looking for? Because I mean, I don't know if people are watching the video portion of this, but Joe has his blue light blocking glasses on. You know, like he's at night interviewing me on the podcast, but he's prepared to avoid or minimize that bright light.
At
And
the risk of looking silly.
no, I mean, you look like someone who's got the foundation set. My morning, so I don't have them on. But so when we talk about, well, what are you using for this, or what are you using for this? You and I already have the assumption that our foundation is pretty 80 to 90% covered. But to the average, maybe not your listener, but my listener is just getting their feet wet into this kind of, health, these health changes. And,
Right.
They're like, oh, I don't have the foundations. I'm listening because I want to get the foundations right.
Right. I wanted to show you one thing that is interesting in terms of, because I think this is quite useful. I look at this a lot. Whenever I do a lab test,
Ooh.
I always look at my genetic predisposition. So you could see I have lower levels of prolactin in a
Yeah.
as a genetic predisposition. And we could check my prolactin. And so, I mean, you could see that sometimes it was lower, sometimes it was higher, right? And this is not due to genetics because this is highly lifestyle
Mhm.
related. And, this is like, it shows that probably this is more my genetic predisposition where something I was doing here brought it up. And so
Yeah.
that's something that you want to explore. What is your genetic predisposition? And the same thing with estradiol, you could see, and other hormones as well. You could see I have higher levels of estradiol and genetic predisposition, right? Doesn't mean I
Yeah.
actually have higher. That's why you get your lab test done. And you could see that my levels tend to be on the higher end
Mm-hmm.
and sometimes they bounce around. Sometimes it's here, right?
Mm-hmm.
This
Yeah.
time it was here. It was like, hey, what was I doing here that was bringing it down? I actually like it when it's on the higher end here. And these are in different units. I think there's more European units,
Yeah.
but
Picomoles. Yeah. Yeah. But
yeah,
still, the point comes across. If somebody's watching this video, you can see the difference.
right. And
Yeah.
so it is important because the bigger the change between your genetic predisposition, like if your genetics show that you have lower estradiol and your levels are higher or vice versa, then that means that there's probably some environmental factor. And as you could see, when you test enough, you could see that I'm a guy and I'm not, I don't have cycles, right?
Yeah.
So it should be pretty consistent. And even with me, it's not consistent. And that means that I'm doing something that's changing the hormones quite dramatically. Again, it's with the prolactin, one time it was 5, one time it was almost 11. So this is why I always like to check. I like to see, okay, I sometimes I do new regimens. What am I doing that is influencing? What could I have been doing that influenced my prolactin levels? And we also you can check up all the things that increase or decrease prolactin on the site. And so that's quite useful when you're getting any kind of lab test, not only hormones, but you can compare your genetic predisposition with your actual labs. And you should do it over time, not just once. And, with software, you can look at the trend
Mhm.
and that helps you see like, okay, well, I could see when this was more towards my genetic predisposition. And what am I doing here that's putting this out of whack? And there's and I think checking also is one of the things that helps motivate me the most. So I'll give you an example. One more example. If we look at testosterone, This is my genetic predisposition, which is typical. Oh, also SHBG, I forgot about that. So it shows typical levels of testosterone, higher levels of SHBG, and I just check it, and we took we look at my total testosterone. I'm pretty average, and it's going down as I get older. Normal people would just be like, "Yep, he's just aging, right?" And then when I looked at it here, I was like a little freaked out. I was like, "What the hell is going on here?" And you could see I took a test a month later, literally a month later, and it just shot up like from 461 to 715 because I got freaked out. Then a year later, I got a little lazy. You see, it went down. And then recently, I was just like, I'm getting my testosterone up naturally, of course. And you could see it's just been going up. So
Hence your newsletter that came out not long ago about testosterone.
exactly. And then HBG, also an interesting one that you want to keep track of. You could see that I'm always on the higher end. And this time, the last time it was quite high just because my estrogen and testosterone were quite high. So that's actually normal reaction in order to not have crazy levels of free testosterone. And so, yeah, but in general, you could see that we have tools now that is allow you to do way more. And for me, they do a bunch of stuff. They keep me motivated. They give me information. How do I increase this? How do I decrease this? And track it over time, and also look at what are my genetic predispositions. And of course, you could look at a whole bunch of other things. Like, for example, if you got low mood, what's your genetic predisposition for that? I have a predisposition for lower mood. And then if you look into that, it shows that my tryptophan hydroxylase gene is off. And so 5-HTP is one of the best things for me in terms of mood. That and the B vitamin cofactors are quite important for me.
First of all, we don't get a lot of education, especially in the United States, around anything health related, and I always joke about this. We get like how to make a baby, and then, in high school, and then it's like, okay, but avoid that. And then that's it. We don't get anything. And I feel like we need every decade, we all need a little refresher of like, here's what happens in your 20s. Here's what you need to look out for. Here's what we can modify. All right, you're hitting your 30s. This is what's going to happen. This is going to change. All right, you're getting in your 40s. Here's what to expect, but here's how you can help avoid it. Man, if we could only have those sorts of conversations, then I think it would do the world a lot of good from a health standpoint versus there's nothing you can do, just like you said, or like that's just age or your genetics, you were born with it. It's like, oh gosh, a lot of it is so modifiable. And you have the greatest examples of, if you trend towards low or high, it didn't matter. Like you knew you could modify it. You can work with what you got. And it's the same when I'm doing hormone testing or hormone risk evaluation on somebody. And they're like, well, that's just, those are the cards I was dealt. I'm like, absolutely not. There's a lot you can do. Let's be motivated. Why wait until you fall off a cliff? Let's find out before the cliff.
Yeah, for sure. And I think it gets to a broader point where I really think the amount of education we get is insane, but people aren't taught the basics about their body, right?
Yeah.
They're not taught the basics about their cycle. What does this mean? What does that mean? Right? How to live healthy. It's kind of basic education to me, right? And people aren't getting it. Like, here's the basics of dopamine. Here's the basics of serotonin. I feel like everybody should know that stuff, right? We talk about serotonin. People are like, yeah, I think I've heard of it. I think I've heard of it once or twice.
Yeah.
Or dopamine. Most people have barely heard of these things. And the amount of, given the amount of education that we're getting, I just feel like people should know, here's the basics of nutrition. Here's what the B vitamins do. Here's why you need to eat certain foods. I don't think we're ever getting that. It's just
I agree.
You might get through osmosis, you should eat vegetables and exercise and whatever,
Right.
but you don't really get any of those details. And especially, for women understanding what these hormones are, I think this is like pretty basic stuff. You really should know. Here's what happens when your estrogen is lower. I ask many women, they have no idea. It's like, oh, my hormones, something's up with my hormones.
Yeah.
What hormone is up and down and what does it mean?
Yes.
When is it? It's like they have no idea of any of the details. So I'm very happy that you enlightened us on all these important details for women. A lot of them also are applicable to men, right? Men
Mm-hmm.
have all these
Mm-hmm.
hormones
Mm-hmm.
like prolactin, as you saw, testosterone, women and men have that as well, estrogen. But anyway, I don't want to take up more of your time. We did go over a bit. I really appreciate you coming on.
Thanks
And
for
yeah,
yeah.
where can people find you and find out more about you?
So I'm predominantly on Instagram at dr.carriejones. My website, www.drcarriejones.com. And then for those practitioners who are interested in labs, as you said in the very beginning of my bio, rupahealth.com. You can learn a whole lot more about labs there.
Awesome. And I'm going to set you up with an account on Self Decode so you can explore
So
that as
excited
well.
so I can geek out.
Awesome. All right. Have a great day. Thanks for
Thanks.
coming
I
on.
appreciate it, Joe.
67% of listeners aren't subscribed to the show, so please don't forget to show your support by hitting the subscribe button now. You'll not only be supporting the show, but also investing in yourself and your health journey, all while helping to keep us ad-free.